Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. I once had a developer admit to having a bot create their commit. They turned to a model without any throttle and now have a steaming pile of token limit exceeded. Anyway, which means this week we gather the co-hosts to cover the news and talk about what makes code secure. Submit a PR and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Ransomware, supply chain attacks, 0 days. Cyber threats don't wait, and neither should your defenses. With ThreatLocker, you're not just reacting to threats, you're stopping them before they start. Our Zero Trust endpoint protection locks down your environment with pinpoint control over what's allowed to run and what's not. No guesswork, no blind spots. Just proactive, built-for-now security that keeps your business moving. Want to see how a true default deny strategy works? Head over to securityweekly.com/threatlocker and take the first step towards shutting the door on threats before they even knock. This is episode 358, recorded November 19th, 2025, but it's going to come out around November 24th or 25th. So, hello from the past. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with my past, present, and hopefully future co-host, John Kinsella. Hello, John.
I haven't run out of tokens yet, and I'm getting ready for some turkey.
That sounds like a good plan. And of course, we have our past, present, and future co-host, Kalyani Pawar as well. Hey, Kalyani, it's been a while. It's good to see you.
My context window was filled up last week, but I'm here with an empty context window today.
So what I'm hearing is I've got to prompt you both for some good topics to get us through the news this week. And as usual, I try to come up with a theme of news and news articles. I think today's theme is secure coding, but more about like either the resources that help us code securely, or what does secure coding even mean? Like, how do we recognize it? What does it take to create it? A program as in a effort, not a program as in a bunch of bits that get executed. So to start on the small scale, I grabbed an article from Trail of Bits because, hey, go interns. This is a write-up from one of their interns. This was their work, actually, I think from last summer or last year. But the title is, "We Found Cryptography Bugs in the Elliptic Library Using Witchproof." And now, the important thing isn't so much this elliptic library, because I don't know how many people out there are really using this in their their Bitcoin wallets or whatever, or their JavaScript-based crypto, which sounds a bit scary. But it was more about grabbing it for this tool called Witchproof, which is a project for helping test cryptography libraries against known attacks, and part of our dear intern's work. This is Marcus Schiffermuller, who he also updated Trail of Bits testing handbook. And the testing handbook I'm a fan of. It has a lot of fuzzing, it has a lot of ways to basically say, we built an application, what's wrong in it? And how do we run some automation to find out what's wrong with it? So I don't know, like, I'll maybe grab you first on this, Kalyani. When you see a testing handbook or testing ideas that are like, use this fuzzer, use this automated tool, how much of that becomes, I'm trying to figure out our criteria. How much of that is the fun part of AppSec that you want to use? How much is it the foundational part of AppSec? Or how much of it is I'll leave the remaining F words for you, John, perhaps. How much of it is a false start for an application, or a secure coding type of program?
I think every time I come across a fuzzer, I think a relatively unsexy part of the problem is figuring out, what do I even fuzz on? Like, if I want to fuzz on something that has it's a critical path for me, that makes more sense than fuzzing on something that's just like a very internal only thing, is going to sunset within like 3 months or so. I think that's a problem with any other tool, actually. But making signal out of what am I supposed to fuzz on exactly is, I think, the rather tough part of the question, rather than the tool itself. And I do have like a few favorite fuzzing tools, like the burp suit has a good collection of those, and then there's Medusa. But yeah, that's how I feel about fuzzing. But I saw John having his opinions on the side.
Yeah,
His expression.
it's interesting the way you talk about that. So I want to respond to that first and then come back to your question, Mike. There is work to get a fuzzer set up and going, but my current worldview is once that fuzzer is working, I want to add it into my CI/CD platform so that as we do releases, we continue to fuzz and make sure we don't have regressions around that in the future. But looking at this particular tool, I usually do what I actually did when I pulled this up. I go and I look like, standard, how many stars are on this? 2.9K. I guess that's the same thing. 300 forks. And then I start looking, what's this C2SP thing? Like, I'm not familiar with them off the top of my head. Community Cryptography Specification Project. Sounds cool. And then go back and look at the fuzzer itself, or the project itself, Witchproof. And they've got this really interesting list of coverage, right? Just, what would you guys call that? 15, 20 different, not protocols, but cryptography standards that they're going to try and test against, which is, someone's put a lot of work into this. So, yeah, hopefully that would actually help out if I made the mistake of trying to do my own cryptographic library.
Yeah, and that's what I realized as I was grabbing this, like the pool of people implementing cryptography is hopefully relatively small because it does need a lot of subject matter expertise, and there's a lot of things that aren't even just that get into what can be fun, like constant time algorithms and a lot of these other aspects of rather just, it's one thing to implement your quantum safe cryptography. It's another way to do it without any side channels. And my hobby is reading about fun side channel stuff and analysis. But that's why I wanted to bring in the idea of what does it mean to do secure code? Because I think we can easily generalize this, that Kalyani was helpfully pointing out. And it sounded sort of like, what I hear is John's perspective is just bring it into the CI/CD, bring it into the pipeline so it's checking the builds. It's not like the developers are responsible for running this. And Kalyani, you did mention burp, and I'm curious, how have you seen burp being used effectively? And in the sense of, are you expecting developers to interact with it, after perhaps not every build, but after major features they're doing? Is it more of your AppSec team or pen testing is checking an app on a monthly or quarterly, some particular cadence? Because that's one of those things is, we as AppSec people say, use burp, but we don't necessarily who should be using it and when should they be using it. So help us fill in those blanks.
I think you bring up a very interesting point about scale here. I feel like my experience with burp was when I was on a pen testing team itself. And we used burp at that time extensively to see what kind of requests we could send to the app, or just like play around with the app, see all kinds of nefarious things we could do. But I feel like now when I've transitioned into a startup world where it's just like a handful of application engineers working with a whole application, like John said, it'd be fun to just like add something to the CI/CD, and that would be like a paved path towards a more secure product. But I think since we're talking about maturity here again, I think it still depends on how mature your AppSec program is, because I think most of the startups were still having one AppSec engineer secure code for or set defaults for most of the critical things that are being built out. And the lower priority things obviously get messed out in the longer run.
And that's a good segue, because it sets up now. Poor John's going to have to suffer here, because we did talk about the OWASP Top 10 a week or so ago. There's a new release candidate for 2025. And we had our unsurprising opinions about it. But one of the things I wanted to highlight about that discussion ties into what you were saying, Kalyani, about maturing a software, an AppSec program, or call it a product security program, or just call it secure coding. Now, as we mentioned before, and the OWASP explicitly even states, it is not a foundation for an AppSec program. it's not a standard. Go and use something like start with something like the ASVS. So I'm not going to pick on people misusing the OWASP top 10 in the ways that it's trying to say, don't use this way. But there are two things that stood out when in our discussion was software supply chain failures, which were not, they were not showing up in the, some 2.6 million apps that had been tested. These are, a couple people, Kalyani, that had taken Burp and a bunch of their scanners and done that at scale, and said, hey, we've got all these vulns, but software supply chain isn't really appearing from these scans, so we're just going to vote it onto the list. And then there's the ever-present insecure design, like basically saying, don't write bad software. If we take the OWASP top 10, obviously it's a bad place to start as a program source, but Kalyani, as you're looking at the OWASP top 10, people still, just intuitively, instinctively go for it? How do you try to turn them away or steer them off of the top 10 into practices that are secure coding, in the sense of don't make these mistakes, instead do these positive things?
I do want to say this, though. I feel like when there were times it was hard for me to make case for a vulnerability to be fixed, I would say, hey, it's a part of OWASP top 10.
Fair,
and so
fair.
it did have some kind of impact on the developer. But I think one of the things to pick on there was some of the OWASP top 10s are I think intentionally generic in a way, because it's harder to list out everything that's wrong with a certain vulnerability. And in my experience, for secure coding, it was always helpful to point out to examples provided by MITRE CWE list, where I could show actual examples of how this is insecure deserialization, and educate a developer on secure coding practices, or even use secure libraries in a way that we don't have to encounter this problem again. But I think so far, like you said, the ASVS list and even the cheat series from OWASP has been very helpful. In sharing with the group of developers to be okay, this is a category of vulnerabilities that we're going to target, and we're going to solve it over the next few quarters. And eventually, you do see those classes of bugs disappear slowly and steadily.
So part of it is that turning this into strategies. How do we do secure coding? It's almost like not necessarily pick a couple CWEs, maybe that's what you're saying, pick a vulnerability class, target that, and maybe that's a way you exercise and see how are the developers reacting. That's how I'm reading between the lines of what you're saying.
Hey, I want to dig in here for a second. I'm not picking on you, Kalyani, but I'm curious on this one. For the average customer you're going after, start a new project, or you integrate, I'll say, with a new software platform called a product. You do your magic. You start working on picking out some of these top 10 items. You start doing the burn down, and everything's perfect. Those developers on these projects, are they fresh out of college? Are they experienced? Are they a mixture of both? Because where I'm going with this is the first time they've seen these OWASP top 10 things coming from you, or they're like, oh yeah, I remember this is my last project, I made the same mistake again?
I think it's a mix of both, but so if a developer has maybe built a whole YDC workflow in the past, I found them to be more, context aware about OWASP top 10 that I was talking about. And also college students, surprisingly, were aware of these things, probably because they had to interview for a security position or something in the past. But I think it's a mix of both. But I have seen developers lying on the whole spectrum, to some being maybe let me try to paste a plain text password. And those are experienced developers, to the ones who are very security aware and don't want to jump the bar in order to just push features out.
And I get it, and it's that startup environment where, specifically when you're building something that first year or two, you're trying to just get something done, show someone a feature and functionality. So it's not so much that you're completely ignoring this, but I was sort of curious what the if things are, I don't want to say if things are changing. I'm trying to be positive and upbeat here for once. If like what the sort of the mood of the room is, but okay, curious.
And I think that conversation is really helpful because I wanted to pull out as I mentioned, insecure design on the top 10. Under its how to prevent, there's a list of about 8 or so bullet points. And 2 of them are establish and use a secure SDLC. That's pretty general. So let's set that aside for a second. But the second one is establish and use a library of secure design patterns or paved road components. And you could, there's bunch of synonyms we could throw for there. And the one underneath that is use threat modeling for critical parts of the app. So I want to go back to you, Kalyani, in that sense of who your audience is and you're talking to, rather than if we were talking about these CWEs. Have you, especially early on, started trying to build that? We just got to show that our concept works. Are you still able to have those conversations about design patterns or frameworks, or is threat modeling a part of that yet? When do you introduce threat modeling into the development lifecycle?
I think a global comment that I would have ever make in this whole conversation is culture. Also, I think if it's something like really nascent, it was a really nascent AppSec program or even a security program for what it's worth. Building culture is hardest at that point versus a more mature one. And in terms of like, when do you introduce threat modeling? I mean, the perfect time would be to introduce it at the beginning itself, at the requirement phase itself. But how often do we see it happen? And we try to introduce like different tools in order to do it. I also like the self-service threat modeling article or approach that I don't remember. I think it was Rippling that released a couple years ago, or Segment. I don't quite remember who released it.
Segment, I think it was, yeah.
I think it was Segment, yeah. But one thing to note, even through self-service threat modeling, I think an important piece is culture. How close are you with developers, and how welcoming they are to this extra work of security? Like security is always a department that creates more work if things are not done correctly. And how are you perceived in those conversations? More as a helper, or a helping hand, or like a blocker? I think that plays a bigger role versus hey, this is a threat modeling exercise and we should just do it. Which I would love for us to do as many threat models as we can. And also, how often do you want to do it, right? Once the product is out there, we're making a few changes to it. And as many times as I would like to threat model an already released product, how often do we even do it? It's not, frequent.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, when you say especially I'm also a fan of just the self-service model, and I would express it as doing the practice of threat modeling, just as you're aware, you as a developer are aware of, what am I writing, what could go wrong, but not necessarily having to document it, formally every single time. And I'm going to tie that into, under that insecure design, the how to prevent, there's another bullet point that says, integrate security language and controls into user stories. And this is actually just right below threat modeling. That's kind of similar. And I'm curious, you can have threat modeling. You can also just say there's security language that we say, this is I'm going to use the joke, I want users to be able to query their records, but make it secure. Yes. Thank you, John. You know this by this point. I'm going to have to come up with a new phrase for 2026. But that feels kind of like a cheesy, it feels like I'm cheating my way out of what that security language looks like in these user stories. And for both of you, John and Kalyani, have you actually ever seen or encouraged explicit security language in user stories? Or is it just assumed?
It's assumed from my point of view.
I'm going to add something here.
Okay.
For a team of developers that are not as experienced in security, my explicit ask is to cover a section called security impact under whatever feature that they're trying to build. And it's just because sometimes the features that they're building directly have to deal with, say, security features like session management or authentication. And yes, this is a security feature and this has direct impact on security, but I would really like to know how we're thinking about security in this whole process and what are the gaps that I can fill here.
Now, so that's helpful because I'm going to pull in there's two more bullets. Just kind of, I'm walking down this how to prevent list. There's integrate plausibility checks, which sounds kind of funny, but I think that's basically the fancy way of saying input validation. And right below that is write unit and integration tests, which I think ties into what you were maybe describing, like what are the security features of this session management or this authentication. That to me is starting to feel like a better way of just saying, oh, we're worried about security. Like Kalyani says, let's have a security section, but how do we prove that we are secure? And that's kind of what I'm teasing out. Does the presence of unit tests, integration tests help build that type of confidence that we've written secure code or that this code is secure by design? Or is this something that's it's necessary but not sufficient? How do you see that as part of the program we're trying to build here?
I think a big signal for me is if the SAST findings on a certain category are low, that means we are secure coding. It's a very tangible result to see, in terms of like how securely are we baking our defaults here. I think that has been a big signal. Or even when you're like externally testing things, and if the same things don't appear again and again, that means you've done your homework, and it's something that has been inbuilt in the way you're building a product.
Ever feel like your network infrastructure is stuck in the past? Meet Meter, the company reimagining what it means to get and stay online. Meter delivers full stack networking, wired, wireless, and cellular, all in one seamless, scalable, and secure solution. From hardware design and firmware to software deployment and support, Meter streamlines every part of your network while giving you all the control and transparency you need. Whether you're managing a branch office, retail stores, or a massive data center, Meter gives you performance, reliability, and the visibility you need to stay in control. Thanks to Meter for sponsoring. Go to securityweekly.com/meter to book a demo now. That's securityweekly.com/meter, METER. Generative AI is powerful, but it comes with real risks, from prompt injection to data leakage misuse and agentic AI. The OWASP Gen AI Security Project unites a global community of expert practitioners who tackle these challenges every day. Together, they've built practical playbooks, adoption guides, and the OWASP Top 10 for LLMs, resources any team can apply right now to strengthen AI security. And it doesn't stop there. This is open source, built by practitioners, for practitioners, working together to secure generative AI. Visit securityweekly.com/OWASP to use the playbooks and join the effort to protect tomorrow's intelligence today. I know that, and one of the things I struggle with that approach too is that it's wonderful to see, hey, our SaaS tools or our SCA tools, they're not finding anything, but the absence of evidence is not necessarily an indicator of security. So it's sort of like, okay, well, I've satisfied my vuln spotting type of desires, but how do I know I'm getting into secure design? And here's where I'm going to pull in one more article. This is from Microsoft. It's their the latest progress update on Microsoft's Secure Future Initiative. Now, I think Microsoft actually has a CISO, like a marketing CISO title. I can't remember exactly what it was. And I will say up front, and apologies to both my co-hosts, I read this so you wouldn't have to. It's definitely verbose, but there's a PDF report in here that's kind of saying, obviously the subtext is, hey, CISA beat us up a while ago about a cascade of avoidable failures, which is my second favorite slogan besides comma, but make it secure. But there's a couple things I wanted to bring out here that might talk less about the vuln spotting and more about whether we're talking about what secure design might look like, whether it's secure coding or around the app. And it's a long way of saying, if we look at the very first of their 6 pillars, there's one called protect identities and secrets. And 2 of their objectives in here would be adopt standard SDKs for identity. So, okay, it's probably thinking like OAuth or something like that. But number 3 on there is phishing resistant MFA. And that feels like one of those things that's, how do we pull this into a AppSec conversation? Because having all of your developers, having all of your employees on basically, passkeys, FIDO based auth is wonderfully phishing resistant, but it's not necessarily part of the OWASP top 10 explicitly. But it feels like if we as AppSec, like you said, Kalyani, are going to be the ones that make a lot of work for people to do we go threat modeling, or do we go like phishing resistant MFA right off the top? How do we? Do you have rubrics? What do you think of for this?
I'm gonna punt to John for this one.
Good call. Yeah, John, you've been too quiet here.
Oh, good. This doc, I'm going to take a step back for a second, quotes Charlie Bell, who's their executive vice president for Microsoft Security. Charlie previously spent 23 years over here at AWS, and was quite influential on how we think about security. And it's not uncommon to be in a meeting, really to this day, where someone goes, well, Charlie wouldn't have put up with that, or Charlie would have thought that was a great idea. So he himself is able to make quite an impression. And I think he left to Microsoft right before I came here, but still it was a pretty big shock for that change. So he himself is a pretty good force to be reckoned with, who moved to an organization. Well, I'll stop there and let you guys fill in the ... I think this doc is interesting. So I went back and looked. I had a previous version of this. I don't think we covered Mike in, I want to say March. Their updates on their Secure Future initiative. It's a very open-ended. They're trying to sort of, cover a lot of things. There's some data in there. There's some things that should have data which doesn't, which tells you there's space for improvement there. The one piece of data which I'd love to see, which we talked about at the beginning of the year when Satya came out and said, we're going to, fix this. I can't remember if this was this year or last year, but I would love to see a stat in here of how much have executives' bonuses been affected based off what they previously said they were going to do. Because the original idea was, we are going to care about security enough, and if your org is not paying attention, your Microsoft org is not paying attention or not actually responding, your bonus as an executive is going to get docked. Show us some meat. Put that in here. That's what would actually show that you guys really care about this. And then the second sort of really broad brushstroke I have on this, just as a AppSec person, is there's a bit more blame here against the customer base than I would find acceptable. And Kalyani, what I mean by say blame there is they're talking about like, oh, you as our customers, this is how you should be securing your services if you're going to work with us. And I think where this came from originally is, hey, we realize we've got some gaps. We're going to work on fixing them. So why are you pointing the finger back at the guys reading the report? That's interesting to me. Is there AppSec pieces in here which I think we can sort of learn from and grow from? It's funny because we were actually just talking about culture 5-10 minutes ago, and they've got a whole section in here on that. What else? Engineering pillars. There's probably some stuff we can go dig through in there around what actually. What I'd love to see, and I haven't read the section, what I'd love to see is how does they keep talking about, how many tens of thousands of engineers, how does an org that is this large, how do you improve that AppSec? How do you make people care? And I think it's the latter part, not so much the OWASP top 10. And then if I wanted to round that off, I don't mean, we're talking about AppSec. I don't care about your 2FA. Dude, you should have had that a decade ago, right? Any of us. So don't be bragging to me about your employees are now using 2FA. That just does nothing for me. I'm trying to not be too snarky. I'm trying to make this sort of a useful feedback for this conversation, right? Let's talk about what is the AppSec? How are you improving your applications? How are you improving your cloud services? What's the things you're actually doing there to improve? And there might be a little bit of this in there. I'm not saying I haven't. I'm not saying it's not. I haven't read the whole thing. But that's sort of what I'd be wanting to focus on.
Yeah, and I'll pull in, and that's where I'll draw our attention to pillar number 4. This is protect engineering systems. And it is a nod to the culture that they're trying to instill, which both you and Kalyani have been noting here. And some of the objectives under this protect engineering systems, I would kind of frame them as they're kind of an outside-in approach, meaning we have all these apps. How do we progressively get down from coarse controls around the apps and then get into the individual apps themselves? Whereas the OWASP top 10 might be an inside-out type of approach. Start with the app and then figure out the ecosystem around the app. And the reason my thinking goes there is that in this protect engineering systems, one of the objectives is complete a software asset inventory. Infamous. This is one of the easy to say, very hard to do, but their little happy Pac-Man pie chart looks like it's improved, and it's Pac-Man almost has his mouth closed. Then they talk about secure code deployment, which includes things like code signing. Repos have branch policies with minimum approver counts, so that's good. You want basically who are the people with context about this repo actually approving and reviewing code. They talk about like secrets detection. That's something to scale. That's to Kalyani's point. Whoever you are, don't write that plain text secret in here. And another one of their objectives is protect the supply chain. And so to me, this feels like, I don't know. I'm coming around to the idea of I'm going to start with maybe it's a little too late, as John pointed out, for the MFA, for my passkeys. So that'll be step 0. But then I'm going to get into that. Protect this, do something about the supply chain and something about the repos themselves, rather than like how people access the repos and how that repo, how the artifacts are built from it, rather than the code itself. But I don't know if that matches how you might start it, Kalyani, because we're talking about, threat modeling. How are people, what are the code, what are the CWs in there? Does what I'm saying even make sense to you? Or are you like, I'm going to go talk to my developers and have a more fun conversation. This dude is off the rails.
Speaking of protecting engineering systems, when I read that, it just sounds as threat modeling to me. When I read something as
fair enough
engineering systems, that's just okay. That's just like, okay, all of us come together, stand in front of a board. Let's draw this thing out. Let's see what the boundaries are, what our assets are. But also like longer term, thinking about like all the pipelines that we have to build, or like we were talking about supply chain security, and that should have been done day 0. But like there's so much backlog even with like supply chains. Now we're talking about all of these new AI fancy agents that are going to go and fix these, make these dependency upgrades for us, which I think we're yet to see how effective that is. But I feel like supply chain will always be a pain for as long as the product exists. And there's also like the asset inventory, like you said, is like the hardest part of the problem, especially even like in startups. Maybe we're like smaller teams, but also like there's so much there's a whole debate we have with velocity all the time. Like everything is so fast and you're often out of sync of what is being built and what is not being built, and things change fast. And so having a complete asset inventory feels like a very hard thing to do when I'm thinking about protecting engineering systems. Yeah, and I think something interesting about like the top 6 pillars is like the first pillar itself talks about like protecting your secrets. And I in my experience, even if that feels like something that you should not be telling, or like enabling MFA is something you should not have to tell, I feel like it is still something that you have to tell to like really small teams, like maybe like 10 people startup. That's still something that you have to mention. But I guess it's just a maturity and scaling problem at the end of the day.
But this is, I'm still just sort of browsing through this. This is an extremely large enterprise with a very wonderful budget. I don't know about software development processes at Microsoft. I would really hope that a developer can't just do a npm install and that's coming straight from the internet. So it feels like those type of, I can see those type of things being a problem in a smaller organization. I know there's dead bodies over there, but still, those type of things feel like they should be table stakes. Yeah, I think this is, I think the report is worth people scanning 38 pages, and just sort of get a sense. Well, you can either get a sense of how you can talk about this stuff, but also maybe think about how is your own organization being affected by this? How do you respond to these things? I mean, it is sort of neat what they're doing on the right-hand side of most of the pages. They've got a breakdown of a given topic, both the Pac-Man thing that Mike was talking about, but also NIST CSF mapping. Does this particular topic pay attention to governance or identity or protection or detection or response or recovery? And then sort of what sort of notes around that. So it's I think to me, one of the harder things is when you try to communicate this stuff within your company or out to your customers, how do you sort of that takes effort, right? To figure out what's the best way to communicate. How are you going to be crisp and clean? How are you going to be data driven? And then how can you categorize so that your customers and your readers actually understand what you're talking about? So from that point of view, kudos.
Then going with my what is it? It's my hypothesis, still yet to be proven, about like this outside in or inside out. If the last part you said too, how do you justify what you've done? How do you show your work? How do you talk to your customers? NIST CSF is obviously in the governance world a great reference. Would you also turn to the ASVS for the similar thing? If we're talking about here's my one app that my team is working on, and I show here's when we went through the checklist of ASVS, does that give you a similar confidence? Would you use that same approach for that type of communication?
To me, at least, end of the day, pick one and run with it. Because a lot of these things is not so much are you talking to ASVS, or are you talking to the NIST standard, are you talking to that over a period of time so that both your leadership as well as your staff as well as your customers can understand how you're changing, right? It's none of these things should be point in time. It's like, hey, if we've got like our requirements for some section of ASVS up to date, okay, what's next? Do we need to think about, are we implementing that yet? Or is that something we'll go do next quarter? And like, how do you provide guidance around those things? That's, I guess that's actually an interesting point. What I just said, it's not so much what did Microsoft do over the last 2 quarters or however often this comes out. Tell me what you're planning on doing next quarter or next year.
Let's put that to the test. Kalyani, you've been very kind with giving us your time today, and I know you might have to run real quick. But before we let you go, what are you going to? You're talking to a team, or John comes and says, "Hey, Kalyani, what are you doing with you and your team AppSec wise next month or next quarter?" What's your answer there? And this is in the ideal world. What do you want your answer to be? I'll be fair that way.
I'm mostly going to talk about like long-term secure design initiatives, about like all the backlog things that I've seen. And hopefully in the next quarter, I'm able to stick to the roadmap is how I'm going to put it. But yeah.
And
that's easy. That's easier said than done, right? Though, like as security people, it's great for us to have a roadmap, or even software developers. But roadmaps are made to be interrupted, like everything else. So the next phone really comes along, like folks have had to deal with this morning, not naming names. There goes your roadmap for today. So
yeah.
And I was going to say a similar thing, because so much of security can be reactive. Like, oh, here's this vuln. We got to go and see are we affected by this. Kalyani, how successful have you been, if you can squeeze us in one more minute that you've got for us, in defending a roadmap and pointing out to either the OWASP Top 10 says we should do this, or this is proactive work that is going to help us in the long term. Don't make us interrupt our roadmap. Have you been able to successfully defend that?
Don't make us interrupt our roadmap, and how successfully I have defended that. I think, and this is purely coming from a place of a startup person, is my priorities change very much on a week by week basis.
Yeah,
depends on what's going to help the business scale, and depends what's going to help the revenue roll in. And if that is going to take precedence over my roadmap, I will have to bend to it. But yeah.
No, thank you for that. I think that's the important, honest answer. What helps the business? What helps the revenue?
Yeah.
Because
And I mean, as AppSec people, we don't want to say no to everything, right? Rather than being like these, oh my God, these people, I don't
yeah,
want to take my
those
ticket
days
to
are
them.
over. Yeah.
Yeah. That's not going to fly.
No, but I know you have to fly, but please stick around for as long as you can. So thank you very much for joining us, Kalyani. It's always fun to have you here.
Thank you.
This is what I was saying before we go to the next topic. It's not 3 words, but I will have to bend would also be a pretty good AppSec in 5 words. How about that?
AppSec in 5 words. Well, let's see what inflation does for 2026, John.
Yes.
We'll get there. But I did want to kind of wrap up this idea of, not to belabor the point, so bear with me, both listeners and John, just this idea of where do we look to for resources? We want to write secure code. We want to have, we don't want to be the one who is dealing with security incidents. For me, my go-to resource is not the OWASP top 10. It's more like the ASVS, or I wouldn't say the NIST CSF because it's too high level. That's where you set a policy. I would point to something like what we see from the Secure Future Initiative and some of their objectives. Because I think those are more concrete. Those have some more clear beginning, middle, and ends in terms of rolling out MFA, rolling out, making sure people are going through some sort of pulling from an internal artifact store or internal mirrors rather than like NPMs directly from the internet. Those feel, like you said, table stakes. So I think I would be putting my IKEA table together of AppSec is how I'd approach this rather than just saying, have we done input validation everywhere? So, and maybe that's the way I'll throw it over to you for some final thoughts, perhaps, on this topic. Where what are the resources you would direct people to?
I don't care. And by what I mean by that is what I mean is exactly that. I don't care. I think we've talked about this before, but really, anytime I'm starting a new project, I might have thoughts in my head. But I'm going to go out and look, right? Like, hey, what is the latest we've got with ASVS? What's the latest from some of the other OWASP projects or NIST or these different groups? Which one fits best into my, the size of my org, the size of the project, the size of my budget? Who am I going to be communicating to? What do I need to communicate to them? What am I developer team like? Are they senior or junior? So like, I think all these things sort of play into how do you then pick one of those tools and go with it? The final thought, I've been thinking about this about 15 minutes ago. I would love to bring it up with Kalyani maybe in the future, but we had a great conversation, is, we're at this point now where more and more teams are starting, I'm bringing LLMs in. Sorry, we almost got the whole episode, but
so close.
One of the things with the modern agentic coding things is you put like a claude.md or some sort of basically a document into your project that says, sort of talks about what it is, how to code and coding standards, things like that. And what's interesting to me, I think, is that's all I'm going to mention the LLMs. We're moving on. If you've survived the last 30 seconds, thanks, stay with me. As dev teams get used to putting context files or something like that in there, do we start saying, hey, why don't you put something in around security too? As in, for this project, we are going to use top 10. These are the things we're working on this quarter. If you have questions about security, these are the places you look to within our organization. That could be interesting to sort of maybe start getting a little bit of influence there.
And I think the one thing I'd add to that is to build on just a little bit is like I mentioned the unit test, integration test earlier. Mm-hmm. I would love to see just a little bit of extra labeling that says, here are the tests that tie into the threat model discussion that Kalyani was having, or that tie into the ASVS or whatever the you don't care context is, as I say affectionately. But it's just showing that we've considered it and we have a test for it. I think maybe that is how I would try to express this, is rather than having, here's our document, here's this other thing, here's our test. We can point that we talked about this on a November, and then in December when we get a bug bounty report, we go back and say, what did that test miss? What were the assumptions we made? And we update our context.md file, and everything becomes a world of markdown. So sounds like a future. Let's see what happens.
And one last thought on that, and then this could be a whole separate conversation. I sort of very offhand said, oh, we'll just add fuzzing to your CI process. I recognize that a modern CI process, you want that thing to move quickly. And something we can talk about in a separate episode is how does CI affect your LLM stuff, because that's really interesting. But yes, fuzzing might take hours, days, depends on if you put a budget around it. So maybe you run it outside your CI process. You run it on separate systems, which that's all they do is they sit there and go crunchy, crunchy. The reason I'm bringing this up is if as your product gets more mature and you get to the point you need to do a pen test, that in most organizations is frequently a scramble of, oh my God, we need to set up an environment where they can test without testing on prod. So, hey guys, how about we set up that environment ahead of time, have it running, do some performance testing on it, do some fuzzing against it so that thing's up and running. And then when you're ready to do your pen test, you can say, hey, it's over there. Go ahead. We've been testing it all week.
You got the crunchy in there for our bingo card for the longtime listeners, but I got nothing to add. I think that's a wonderful way to take us out this week. Thank you, John.
Pleasure as always, Mark.
Want to say thank you once again to Kalyani for joining us. And of course, thank you, everyone. Please do remember to subscribe. Check out the show notes. I have a couple extra links that from the articles we covered on this segment, and share about us on the socials, especially if you have opinions on the fuzzing, the supply chains, or just what your versions of table stakes are. And speaking of having all my co-hosts with me today, check out Side by Side by Yota. Always love highlighting some synthwave. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.